Freud, His Contributions to Modern Thought by Frank J. Machovec. Published by the Peter Pauper Press, Mount Vernon, New York, 1973. Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 of Jewish parents in Freiburg, Moravia, now Czechoslovakia. When he was 4 years old, his family moved to Vienna, and he remained there until he was 82, when Nazi anti-Semitism forced him to take refuge in England. Freud graduated from the University of Vienna Medical School, and he interned at the Vienna General Hospital, where he studied the anatomy of the brain and researched the action of cocaine and its then mysterious effect on pain. He was a neurologist by training, not a psychiatrist. Awarded a traveling grant in 1885, he went to Paris's famed Salpêtrière Clinic to observe the use of hypnosis in the treatment of hysteria by Dr. Jean M. Charcot, an expert in this field. In 1889, he traveled to Nancy and studied hypnotic techniques under Bernheim. Freud was fascinated with the use and effect of hypnosis, since in that state, patients more freely communicated their innermost thoughts and feelings. He married in 1886, the same year he began his general medical practice. He lectured at the University of Vienna. In 1892, he began using a couch for his patients, the popular symbol of the psychoanalyst. Freud would sit in a chair, out of the patient's sight, listening and occasionally taking notes, as the patient spoke freely about whatever came to mind. At about this time, he discontinued using hypnosis and searched for a method of treatment which could be effective with anyone. He was disappointed that not everyone could be hypnotized, that the depth of the trance state varied from one patient to another, and symptoms could recur in time or come through in some different behavior. In 1893, Freud and Dr. Joseph Breuer, a close friend with similar research interests, jointly published the first major work on their approach to psychotherapy, on the psychic mechanisms of hysterical phenomena. They called their method psychocatharsis, or the talking cure. They described how having patients talk out their problems and feelings somehow lessened anxiety and reduced or completely relieved symptoms and complaints. Such a simple and straightforward approach to treatment was contrary to accepted medical practice. It caused much bitter controversy. Freud commented, "It rains abuse." Breuer, the man who actually originated the talking cure, preferred to practice medicine in a more quiet and peaceful atmosphere. He decided to abandon further research in this area, and Freud continued with it alone. In 1896, Freud called his unique method of treatment psychoanalysis. Today, that term refers only to Freudian and to no other theory of personality or system of therapy. Freud visited the United States in 1909 with Sander Ferenczi and Carl G. Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist who later disagreed with Freud and formulated his own theory of behavior, which he called analytical psychology. Freud met A. Brill and Ernest Jones, two psychiatrists who were to become major figures in the spread of psychoanalysis throughout England and the U.S. By 1920, Freud had developed an international reputation, and his theory was the object of much discussion and debate. Even today, mentioning his name can cause a spirited and heated exchange of opinion. On the personal side, Freud was in many ways the image of the typical Victorian husband and father. He could be proud, aloof, and stubborn, and very proper. He would not tell or listen to a dirty joke. He disliked small talk and arguments. He enjoyed weekly card games with the same circle of friends. His favorite outdoor activity was hiking in the woods and mountains, where he often picked wild flowers. Collecting curios gave him great enjoyment, and he especially liked Egyptian and early Greek pieces. Intellectually, he had a sharp, analytical mind coupled with imagination, ingenuity, and the ability to express himself clearly and forcefully. At an early age, he wrote, I became aware of my destiny to belong to the critical minority. This gave him, as he put it, a certain independence of judgment. He could read in 6 languages, and his favorite authors were Ibsen, Milton, and Shakespeare. Freud's own writing was clear and concise, and his style smooth, spirited, and consistent. In fact, he was awarded the coveted Goethe Prize for literature. Freud smoked up to 20 cigars a day, and it was cancer of the throat which eventually caused his death. Toward the end, he underwent over 30 operations, and he consistently refused sedatives and narcotics, despite what was surely a very painful condition. I prefer to think in torment, he wrote, than not think clearly. He remained a clear thinker and a prolific writer to the last. He died in 1939 at the age of 83. He was survived by his wife, 3 sons, and 3 daughters, one of whom, Anna Freud, became a psychoanalyst who specialized in childhood behavioral disorders. None of his sons became doctors or followed in his footsteps. His message. There have been men throughout history who gave society a sudden jolt, what Freud might call a shock of reality. Columbus was such a man when he claimed and then proved that the world is indeed round, and that there are other lands and peoples. Darwin was such a man when he told us we are not so different or special, not all that different from lower animals. Recent research on behavior and its modification continues to support his theory. And Freud was such a man when he stopped us with the question, who do you think you are anyway? And he asked many other searching questions as to why and how we got to be who we are, or who we think we are. He showed us unpleasant things about ourselves, how we really feel about authority figures, about each other, and about ourselves. He annoyed us by focusing on the importance of sex and the sex drive at a time when it was proper to hide even a piano's legs, a fact, for the sake of good taste and so as not to be obscene. He told us our dreams are important, and he explained what they mean. He told us most of our real thoughts and feelings are below the level of consciousness, that we are therefore only partially aware of what and how we think and feel. He told us our dreams are important, and he explained what they mean. He told us most of our real thoughts and feelings are below the level of consciousness, that we are therefore only partially aware of what and how we think and feel. This small book cannot hope to describe fully all that Freud taught. His collected works are contained in 24 volumes. This book is but a taste of his insight, an easily read introduction to the man and his message. The more interested student of behavior can find many more books in any major library. Then why write another? Because Freud's ideas have survived the test of time and the competition of other theories. No other theory has as yet had the same dramatic impact, the same effect worldwide, nor found itself applied in so many ways. We see Freud's ideas in art, drama, literature, politics, music and dance, and in the interpretation and deeper understanding of mythology, religion, and philosophy. We see applications of Freudian theory in our everyday lives, in TV commercials, newspaper and magazine ads, and in current marketing and merchandising techniques and practices. We use Freud's ideas, sometimes even his words, to explain slips of the tongue, forgetting names, our likes and dislikes in people, places, foods, and things, and to explain how and why we avoid facing our real thoughts and feelings and those of others. One man who has observed and explained so much with such amazing insight and clear perception, with such a fantastic ability to analyze, then clearly explain behavior, deserves to be heard by anyone interested. The reward, and one he would have deeply appreciated, is sharpened self-awareness and deeper understanding of self and others. May it be so for you. The iceberg of your mind. Freud described the mind as functioning much like an iceberg. An iceberg, he said, is at least 1/10 above water and visible, and 9/10 below the water and invisible. Our conscious thoughts and feelings are all in the visible part of the mind, in the 1/10 which we can talk about without too much difficulty and which we can remember easily. It is that part of your mind at work as you read these lines. Hopefully, as we proceed more deeply into his theory, you will be able to plumb some of the deeper content. Just below the surface are thoughts and feelings we have suppressed. These can be recalled, but with some difficulty. It is like the area of the iceberg just under water level where light from the surface filters through. Freud called this the pre-conscious. He described the mechanism which pushes its content below consciousness as suppression. The unconscious is Freud's word for the deepest and most hidden part of the mind, that part of the mind's iceberg far below the surface and generally beyond reach. Everything ever said or done to you is buried in the unconscious. It is the largest part of the mind. Thoughts and feelings, experiences and desires in this cluttered basement are much too painful, embarrassing, or shameful to come up. The mechanism which keeps them hidden, Freud called repression. A psychological wound or shock, or trauma, is thus repressed into the unconscious. It is gone from consciousness, but never really forgotten. It rises to the surface in the form of irrational behavior, neurotic symptoms and habits, and it can appear, cleverly disguised, in dreams. Freud's own description of the unconscious is as follows. In this are our repressions, that which we do not recognize and will not accept, and also all of our experience, all of our motives, and all of our thoughts, somehow modified. No one consciously goes down into this subterranean, labyrinthian area. The human mind was to Freud a great unconscious reality, which contained the raw, elemental instincts of our animal ancestry. In observing this, Freud was some 50 years ahead of Robert Artry, Desmond Morris, and other modern writers who describe our behavioral similarities to the so-called lower animals. We do have primitive instincts, weakened by thousands of years of evolution, controlled by the laws and customs of society, religious taboos, and further frustrated by our own personal code of conduct. The method, psychoanalysis. By freeing the unconscious of its secrets, there is a release of tension, a decrease of anxiety. With a more relaxed state of mind, it is possible to see yourself with greater clarity, the good and the bad, strengths and weaknesses. A deeper understanding and sorting out process begins, and gradually the real you emerges. This, in very simple terms, is what psychoanalysis is all about. The analyst takes the patient back to uncover life experiences which are causing anxiety in the present. This going back technique is called anamnesis. It's a lot more easily said than done. Freud found that the most effective way to accomplish this self-discovery of the unconscious is for you, the patient, to describe whatever comes to your mind, regardless of how trivial it may seem. This talking out of every random thought is called free association. The analyst says very little and tries very hard not to get in the way, condition the patient, or interfere in any way with the free flow of thoughts and feelings. The analyst is an active listener. In psychotherapy, such a passive role for the therapist is called non-directive. Psychoanalysis is a non-directive therapy. Psychoanalysis takes time. Usually, the patient meets with the analyst about an hour once or more each week. The total length of time for treatment varies with the individual, but 2 years is a rough average for the process. Sometimes a patient can be in analysis for 5 years, and the total cost for that kind of therapy can exceed $7,000. Most patients go back to their analyst from time to time as needed, but many of them continue in analysis for years. This long-term time requirement is one of the major criticisms of psychoanalysis. Another criticism is the lack of research in the actual effectiveness of the therapy. It seems to be a highly individualized method of treatment, most difficult to measure with existing tests. Sometimes it is so individualized, the patient develops a deep emotional attachment to the analyst. This is called transference. Since Freud, there have been many new and different innovations in therapy. Others have tried to shorten the time required, increase effectiveness, and lessen the cost. None have been universally accepted as yet. Today, orthodox psychoanalysis is not the majority voice in psychotherapy. The truth is that there is no majority voice. But Freudian theory, in one form or another, often used unknowingly and going unrecognized, is standard procedure in psychiatry, social work, sociology, and in marriage and family counseling. What many of these professional helpers use are Freud's emphasis on searching for the ultimate cause of behavior, seeing through defense mechanisms, and understanding the symbolic disguises most commonly used by the unconscious. Psychoanalysts are almost always medical doctors. In addition, they must undergo a training analysis before they can, in turn, psychoanalyze others. While Freud approved of this learn-by-doing training process, he did not feel that psychoanalysis should fall solely into the medical field, or, for that matter, in clinical psychology. In 1927, Freud gave the opinion that psychoanalysis is not a specialized branch of medicine. I cannot see, he continued, how it is possible to dispute this. Psychoanalysis is a part of psychology, not of medical psychology in the old sense, not of psychology of morbid processes, but simply of psychology. Dreams. The dream which is not interpreted is like a letter which is not read. These words from the Talmud sum up Freud's high opinion of the value of the dream work. Dreams, he taught, are a wish fulfillment, and they are triggered by events of the 24 hours preceding the dream. That, in a nutshell, is Freud's theory on the interpretation of dreams. The dream images as they are experienced, what is happening to you and others during your dream, are called manifest content. The real meaning, the deeper meaning, is called latent content. To understand our dreams, we must develop a third eye, so as to see through the obvious and peer into the deeply meaningful, to see through the symbols. Children's dreams are usually simple and direct fulfillment of a wish they felt the preceding day. Freud reported many such dreams. There was 22-month-old Hermann, whose uncle had a basket of big, ripe cherries, but gave Hermann only one of them. The next day, Hermann awakened by saying, "Hermann eaten all the cherries." A 3-year-old girl had a boat ride across a lake while on vacation. That night, she dreamt she had spent the whole day on the lake. The real-life ride wasn't enough, and she wished to go back and spend more time there. Adult dreams are usually more sophisticated and more cleverly disguised. Freud described a dream of a Munich medical student. The student dreamed that he was riding his bicycle down the street when a brown dachshund ran up and bit him on the heel. He tried to chase the dog away, but the animal had a firm grip on him. The day before the dream, he remembered seeing a girl he had never met, but whom he felt he loved from a distance. He was riding his bicycle at the time, and she was walking her dog, a brown dachshund. His dream was a wish that they met, and he was willing to be attacked by her dog to fulfill that wish. Many criticize Freud for seeing sex in everything. It is true that he had a great deal to say about the ways we hide our basic feelings and instincts, sex being perhaps the best example. But sex in the Freudian sense also includes preservation and survival of the species, sometimes not included by the critics. We are surrounded by people doing their thing in their social and business lives, channeling their basic needs and drives into socially acceptable outlets. Perhaps you call this energy. Freud called it sex. We do hide our basic needs and feelings. No other instinct, Freud wrote, has been subjected to so much suppression as the sexual instinct. From no other instinct are so many and such powerful unconscious wishes left over, ready to produce dreams in a state of sleep. For the critics, it should be pointed out that Freud also said that while sex is an important basic drive, we should avoid the exaggeration of attributing exclusive importance to it. If sex is so suppressed, it should not be surprising to discover that we become experts at disguising it in our dreams. In our dreams, bodies become houses. Smooth sides or tall buildings are male. Balconies, porches, and similar shapes are female. Everyday evidence. She sure is stacked, or what a front porch. Male sex symbols resemble the male functions. Knives, sticks, guns, and the like. Female sex symbols resemble the female function. Pocket, doorway, room, bag, hallway, mouth, and so on. Men generally dream of sex openly and directly. Sometimes they embellish it by having a harem or an orgy with two women at the same time, or with a woman of a different race or culture. Women also dream of sex without disguise, but because of childhood conditioning, tend to be more indirect about it. You won't have any guilt feelings if in your dream you are raped, or if you find yourself on a desert island with a man and there is no rescue in sight. Or if you are someone else from another period in history. Failing this, you can substitute another man for the person you really love, and since he's unreal and imaginary, there's less harm in it. Freud cautioned against overestimating the importance of symbols. Generally, we share most dream symbols in common. The hypnosis study proved that. There have been similar studies worldwide, including people of various cultures who have the same kinds of dreams. What is of utmost importance is the association of the dreamer, what the dream symbol means to that particular dreamer. And this is based on the dreamer's own individual life experience. It is not so much what the books or the experts say, but what the dream really means, which is the key to successful interpretation. This makes dream analysis difficult for the average person because we tend to see what we want to see, what we have been conditioned to see, and not what is really there. Freud called the individual's own unique use of dream symbols association. Dreams can involve displacement, or substituting a dream symbol for the actual wish or desire. Dreaming of flying or floating is fairly common and can have various meanings. One of Freud's patients was short, and she dreamt she was floating down the street, several inches from the ground. In this way, she achieved two wishes. First, she was taller, and that pleased her very much. Second, the lady had a low self-concept, and this raised her stature. It elevated her. Another patient flew through the air like a bird in her dream. She was frustrated and wanted to be free as a bird. Men who dream of flying usually associate it with power by being hawks or eagles, or with sex if it involves going up or getting it off the ground, a preoccupation with erection. Freud also described reversal, which means a dream situation the opposite of what is really felt and wanted. Someone who loves life and has spent a particularly joyful day may dream of death. It is not a wish for death, but rather a wish that the joy continue without end. Parts of the body can be reversed, most frequently the top or head for the bottom or sex organs. We have cheeks on our face and on our buttocks. Female labia are called lips. The glands penis and labia minora have been described as being as sensitive as the inside of your mouth. When we try to analyze our dreams, we are limited only to that which is remembered. It is a good idea, therefore, to keep a notepad and pencil near the bed and quickly note the dream content immediately upon awakening. Freud pointed out three possibilities of error in dream interpretation: missing the content, overestimating it, and underestimating it. The first thing to do is remember the dream. Use the notepad, then fill in details missing from your written list. Ask yourself these questions. Is this all? Is the dream now complete? What of the exact sequence of events in the dream? How does this dream relate to others you've had? Calvin S. Hall suggests this checklist: actions and traits of the dreamer in the dream, other persons recognized or deliberately unrecognized or made into strangers in the dream, interactions with others during the dream and the nature of the relationship, how do you feel in each situation with each person, the setting, where, time of day, season, weather, details, etc., and what these mean to you, changes during the dream, in people, things, or setting, and the outcome of the dream, manifest or as it happened factually, and latent, what does it mean to you? A clue here is how did you feel afterward? Doing all this minimizes the possibility that you'll miss some important clue and miss the dream's full meaning. Don't be discouraged if you find it difficult to remember your dreams. The superego, the censor, is the night watchman who slams the door of the unconscious as soon as we awaken. The notepad at your bedside will help overcome this problem. If you are unable to interpret your dreams, if you have nightmares or recurrent dreams which disturb you, consult a professional. Many behavioral experts feel that Freud's greatest contributions were his theory of the unconscious and his work in dream interpretation. Freud himself described his dream theory as the most valuable of all the discoveries it has been my good fortune to make. Insight such as this, he wrote, falls to one's lot but once in a lifetime. Dream symbols. One of the best ways to interpret dreams is to know what the more common dream symbols mean. Freud compiled quite a list, and his followers added to it. For example, Calvin S. Hall listed 102 symbols for the penis, 95 for the vagina, and 55 for sexual intercourse. Remember that what a given symbol means to you may not mean exactly the same thing to me. But don't be a prude and invent or force different meanings for these symbols. That may mean you're denying or avoiding your true feelings. Here are some common dream symbols. Parents are commonly disguised as authority figures: kings, queens, presidents, governors, executives, diplomats, policemen, military officers, prison guards, or bosses. Children, brothers, and sisters are often dreamed of as small animals, sometimes even rodents. Male sex symbols: a stick, pole, arrow, spear, flower stem, tree trunk, umbrella, knife, nail file, sausage, cigar, pen, hand, finger, foot, nose, necktie, hat, gun, hammer, tool, airplane, heavy machinery, sharp mountain peak, tall building, obelisk, telephone pole, pillar, key, the numerals 1 or 3, etc. Female sex symbols: a small box, purse, chest, drawer, cupboard, vase, cup, glass, bowl, oven, ship, mouth, ear, eye, valley, room, doorway, tunnel or hallway, window, soft chair, board or shelf, table, altar, rounded mountain with trees, lock, keyhole, the numerals 0 or 8, etc. Sexual intercourse: walking up a steep incline, jogging, riding a horse, plowing a field, shooting a gun, walking upstairs, climbing a ladder, or any act which involves penetration, pumping, rhythmic motion up and down or in and out, etc. Masturbation: playing a piano, petting small furry animals, even beating a child. castration fear, baldness, beheading, losing a tooth, getting a haircut, or actual castration. Superego. Why is it so difficult to remember dreams? There seems to be a built-in sensor or screening device that slams the door of memory and consciousness when we awaken. It is a puritanical self, a superparent, monitor, or conscience. This is what Freud called the superego. It is one of three major personality factors in Freudian theory. In order to get past this censor, your unconscious disguises your dreams and transforms them into a production which would be the envy of the most gifted TV or movie screenwriter. That also tells you how potent the superego can be, if it takes so much imagination and ingenuity to bypass it. The id. Influencing you from an opposite pole is the id. The superego is Dr. Jekyll, and the id is Mr. Hyde. Robert Louis Stevenson, author of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, was himself a medical doctor, and he probably observed these two personality factors in his own practice. The id is the primitive instinctual self, the beast within. When you're following your diet and you look longingly at the hot fudge sundae the person next to you is enjoying, it's the id in you which says, why not? If the person with the sundae is attractive to you, that's the id again saying something like, what if? The ego. Caught in the middle between the pure white superego, full of should and ought, and the earthy id with its what the hell, is a reasoning compromiser called the ego. Ego is the mediator, the manager, the moderator, the middleman between id and superego. The id is the conscious mind, the self-aware of the present passing moment. Your ego reads these lines and thinks on them. The ego tries to be adult, use the morals and ethics fed to it from superego, and yet it lets just enough pleasure and enjoyment flow from id to maintain balance. The ego tries to be adult, use the morals and ethics fed to it from the superego, and yet it lets just enough pleasure and enjoyment flow from the id to maintain balance. That's hard to do, for one or the other tips the balance one way, then the next. Life is a dynamic balance. Balance and imbalance. These three personality factors function as if in a triangle, with the ego at the top and the superego and id beneath, confronting each other and exerting pressure on the ego above. Imagine such a triangle made of cardboard, fixed to the wall by a tack stuck through the top of the triangle, at the ego. As the id exerts pressure, the triangle moves so that the id rises and the superego is further suppressed. If the superego rises, the id is suppressed. Throughout the process, the ego is the balancing point. Freud described the ego's balancing function in this way. The severest demand upon the ego is probably the keeping down of the instinctual claims of the id. But the claims made by the superego also may become so powerful and so remorseless that the ego may be crippled, as it were, for its other tasks. The ego is concerned with discovering the most favorable and least perilous method of obtaining satisfaction, taking the external world into account. If superego won all the time, you would become perfectionistic, hypercritical, blaming, hypersensitive, supermoralistic, rigid, stubborn, and inflexible. If the id won most of the time, pleasure-seeking would be the rule, and you drink, smoke, gamble, philander, and eat, all to excess. If ego controls too much, you would tend to intellectualize feelings and values, become self-centered, irrelevant, super-reasonable, and behave more like a computer than a human being. Where do these three personality factors come from? Freud taught that the id is an instinctual inheritance, part of our animal heritage, with us at birth, probably even before. The ego develops next at about 6 months of age, as soon as you can tell the me from the not me. Actually, Freud felt the ego is really an educated, conditioned part of the id, formed and modeled by reacting with external reality. He felt that at birth, all is id. The superego is 5 or 6 years in the making, and it is developed mainly from the influence, action, and control of parents, mainly the father. Libido, the life force. There is a basic life force which is channeled into and through the ego and invested in the self, persons, and things. Freud called this basic psychic energy the libido. Since it is involved so deeply with life and life processes, he felt it was the dynamic manifestation of sexuality. Freud was convinced the libido streams into the ego from various organs of the body. He referred to the nature of sexual excitation as an example, beginning in the sex organs and progressing through the whole body in an ever-increasing reaction of emotion and physical response. The most prominent of the parts of the body from which this libido arises, he observed, are described by the name of erotogenic zones, though, strictly speaking, the whole body is an erotogenic zone. The ego, Freud believed, is always the main reservoir of libido. Neither the id nor the superego has libidinal energy. Everything that we know about it, the libido, relates to the ego, in which the whole available amount of libido is at first stored up. We call this state primary narcissism. In Freudian theory, narcissism is self-love, named from the Greek legend of the beautiful lad Narcissus, for whom nothing was more pleasing than his own mirrored image. From its central base in the ego, the libido is invested in people and objects in the external world. Freud called this investment of the libido a cathexis. According to Freud, there is a constant transformation of ego libido into object libido and of object libido into ego libido. For instance, a woman cathects or invests her libido and her money, which is an extension of her ego, in a pretty new dress. It becomes her favorite dress. She identifies with it. When she wears it, it becomes part of her. Her libido is cathected from her ego to the object. In wearing it, the object libido flows back to her ego in the form of narcissistic libido. Another example. A man identifies with his new car. He cathects his libido in it. Whenever he drives it, he has a built-in ego trip. In both these cases, the ego is, as Freud described it, the great reservoir from which all object cathexis is sent out, and into which it is drawn back again. Eros and Thanatos, the life-death instinct. The libido has a dual nature, a potential for good or for evil. Freud saw libidinal instinct as a polarity of two opposing qualities: Eros, the creative, positive, life-supporting, self-preserving instinct, and Thanatos, the destructive, negative death wish. Man's highest achievements are the result of Eros libido. Wars and violence stem from Thanatos libido. Man's highest achievements are the result of Eros libido. Wars and violence stem from Thanatos libido. Modern personality theory has no better explanation for these extremes in behavior. In fact, many theories do not even consider these realities. In this respect, Freud even today remains ahead of his time. The oral, anal, and genital phases. There are 3 times in our lives when the libido focuses on specific body functions. The first is the oral phase, and it occurs from birth to about the end of the first year. It is a period of mouth-centered activities such as sucking, biting, and chewing, the functions necessary for survival at that age. The next period is the anal phase, from about age 1 through age 3, and it centers on anal functioning, the holding in or the pleasurable expelling of feces. The third and last stage is the genital phase, and it is developed from about age 3 to puberty and beyond. The genital phase can be further divided into 3 parts. The phallic phase, age 3 to 7, a time of self-discovery when boys discover the penis and girls the clitoris. The latency period, age 7 to 13, a relatively quiet stage, what Freud described as arrested development. And the genital phase, from puberty onward, when the sex drive is fully developed and directed toward the opposite sex. The oral phase causes such mouth-centered activities as thumb-sucking, nail-biting, chewing gum or pencils, puckering our lips or putting things to or into our mouths, smoking, especially cigars, and mouth-genital sexual techniques. Some behavioral scientists feel that alcoholism, a bottle-centered activity, involves the oral phase. Compulsive eating, nibbling, or midnight snacks can relate back to the dependency and emotional satisfaction of this nursing period in early life. Freud held that there can be a psychological cause for certain cases of constipation and diarrhea, or alternating bouts of both of these anal-centered conditions. He observed that there are people who exhibit 3 personality traits in common, all of them related to the anal phase of early life: orderliness, obstinacy, and parsimoniousness or a miserly nature. He referred to this combination of traits as an anal character. As for everyday examples of the genital phase, a glance at TV commercials, newspaper and magazine ads, billboards, and leafing through paperbacks and magazines in any newsstand provide more than ample proof of its existence, and also its wide scope and power. Older men, or any man, staring at girls on the beach, or anywhere, are living evidence of this phase. If homosexuals are cited as an exception, notice how they too observe members of their own sex they find attractive. Angst, or anxiety. Anxiety is that butterflies in the stomach feeling of impending doom, that nagging fear that somehow something's very wrong. Freud used the German word Angst, and many behavioral scientists feel the German word is more descriptive than its English equivalent. Anxiety is, first and foremost, a feeling and not a thought, and it is, as Freud put it, obviously unpleasurable. Neurotic anxiety does not focus on a specific situation, person, or place. It is anxiety in regard to a danger which we do not know. We have a fear that something bad is going to happen, but we don't know what it is. If we know the reason, we have true or real anxiety. It is based on a known danger. Signal anxiety is when we feel anxious anticipation. When there is a danger situation correctly assessed as such, some instinctual anxiety is added to the rest. This is a natural, spontaneous reaction arising from the threat to survival, and rooted in the instinct for self-preservation. In reacting in this way, we are not so different from the animals in the wild, wary to the point of being jumpy and defensive. Freud taught that there is always a definite physical reaction when there is anxiety. It can take many forms: weeping, lump in the throat, cold and clammy hands, perspiration, tremors and twitching, restlessness, headache, a need to urinate, diarrhea, and nervous stomach, to name a few of the more common symptoms. This mind-body interrelationship is part of anxiety. In Freud's words, anxiety is a specific state of unpleasure accompanied by motor discharge along definite pathways. Anxiety is perceived in the ego. After all, the id, with its primitive instincts and natural drive to freely indulge itself, has no need to feel anxious. That would defeat its purpose and lessen its influence and effect. The superego is absolutely sure of itself, knows exactly what should be happening without any exceptions, and so it too has no need to feel anxious. The ego, caught in the middle as usual, between want and shall not, deals with anxiety regularly in the many decisions faced every day. When the ego is forced to acknowledge its weakness, Freud observed, it breaks out into anxiety. Reality anxiety in face of the external world, normal anxiety in the face of the superego, and neurotic anxiety in face of the strength of the passions of the id. In childhood, anxiety arises most frequently from loss of a love object. Most of us can remember how upset we or our children have been when a favorite toy was broken or lost. Children crying for their mother or father standing near them, following them from room to room, is what Freud described as anxiety from the reaction to the danger of object loss. Phobias develop when the attributes of true and neurotic anxiety are intermingled. The danger is known and of the real type, but the anxiety in regard to it is disproportionately great, greater than in our judgment it ought to be. It is by this excess that the neurotic element stands revealed. People who are phobic about flying in airplanes really fear an air crash, but their fear is greater than is reasonable. In like manner, train, bus, car, surgery, blood, and other phobias are rooted in a fear of some inevitable, unavoidable tragedy beyond anyone's control. It becomes a phobia when the fear is out of proportion, especially with respect to the chances of the tragedy actually happening. Freud divided phobias into two categories: common phobias, or an exaggerated fear of all those things that everyone detests, of fears to some extent such as night solitude, death, illness, dangers in general, snakes, etc., and specific phobias, those which do not normally arise in people, for example, agoraphobia and the other phobias of locomotion. Actually, phobias are a form of self-defense, a way of defending against anxiety. To illustrate, Freud used the example of a man unable to cross a street. If the man tries to cross the street, the result will be an attack of anxiety, just as an attack of anxiety in the street has often been the exciting cause of the establishment of an agoraphobia. Thus, Freud reasoned, the phobia prevents anxiety. If he is unable to cross the street, he can never have an anxiety attack in the street. The phobia, Freud concluded, is thrown up before the anxiety like a frontier fortress. Neurosis. Who's neurotic? According to Freud, there is an immense number of sufferers from severe neuroses. He felt that there are enough of them to form a class of psychological patients. They resemble the psychotics very closely, but they are better able to adjust to themselves and to their life situations. They're not at all happy about their adjustment. That's why Freud referred to them as sufferers and sharing a misery of a particular sort. And it's the suffering, the misery, which makes them neurotic. A neurosis develops from a conflict between the ego and its id. The essence of neurosis is the fact that the ego, the more highly organized part of the mental apparatus bred up under the influence of the outer world, cannot fulfill its function of mediation between id and reality. It retreats and suffers the consequences of symptoms, reaction formation, anxiety, and loss of control. Freud called universal the coexistence of two different attitudes, contrary to each other and independent of each other. One belongs to the ego, and the opposing one, which is repressed, belongs to the id. What happens is that the id pushes for more expression of unconscious wish fulfillment, and the ego, trying as always to mediate, reacts against it. Freud declared with absolute certainty that the theory behind all psychoneurotic symptoms must be conceived as wish fulfillments of the unconscious. The symptoms can be fairly described as the return of the repressed, or the erupting of hidden, secret wishes in some disguised symbolic form. The symptoms are substitutive satisfaction of some sexual impulse, or they are attempts to prevent such substitutions. Most of the time, they are a compromise between the two. Unlike phobias, a neurosis has deep roots, buried in the deeper unconscious strata of the mental apparatus. Freud traced neurosis back to early childhood, before age 6, even though symptoms may not make their appearance until much later. But in every case, Freud claimed, the subsequent neurotic illness has this prelude in childhood. He was very firm on this point. Childhood neurosis is not the exception, but the rule. There is not a single adult neurotic, he wrote, in whom the indications of a childhood neurosis fails of occurrence. Neurosis, then, is a rebellion of the child's id, the natural spontaneous needs, desires, and impulses, against the conformity and restrictions of society and the ego's best efforts to control them. In Freud's own words, the ego has made an attempt to suppress certain parts of the id by an inappropriate method, and this has miscarried, and the id has taken revenge. Freud's conclusion: neurosis is thus the consequence of a conflict between ego and id. He went on to say that the ego loses in such cases, because at the time, the ego is undeveloped and weak. Freud described 3 kinds of actual neurosis: neurasthenia, involving mind-body or psychosomatic disorders such as cranial pressure, fatigue, dyspepsia, constipation, etc., hypochondria, which he felt was related to neurasthenia, and anxiety neuroses, those involving disordered thinking such as anxiety, restlessness, insomnia, phobias, etc. He described a neurosis which involves a recurring idea or act: cleanliness, neatness, ritualistic acts. These usually declare themselves in the second period of childhood, from 6 to 8 years of age. He called them obsessional neuroses, and he analyzed them as related to a sexual deed performed with pleasure in childhood. A deep and severe psychological shock can and often does cause what Freud called a traumatic neurosis. By Freud's own admission, these may be an exception to his theory of neurosis. Their relation to the infantile factor has hitherto eluded investigation. A physical illness can so weaken the ego that a neurosis can develop. In such cases, the illness seems to increase the strength of the instincts beyond the limits to which the ego is matched. According to Freudian theory, the normal person has an ego strong enough to cope with reality and with the buried wishes and drives from the unconscious. The normal ego manages to maintain a balance, a dynamic, changing, precarious balance. Freud speculated that the ego is not thoroughgoing even in perfect psychic health, and the extent to which it maintains balance indicates the degree of our psychic normality. What's normal? Realizing you're a mini atlas, holding up your world, and not entirely sure you're doing so well at it. That's pretty much the idea. The neurotic is an atlas overpowered, whose muscles twitch and tremble, and who's frankly afraid he'll let go at any moment. It's the fear or anxiety of losing control which is behind most neurotic conditions. The ego and id are in conflict. The ego is appealing, be reasonable, and the id cries out, be me. The psychotic's atlas has given up. The ego cannot cope at all, and it is as if it decided to go on vacation for a while. There isn't anyone at home anymore. Neurosis and psychosis are clearly intimately related, and yet at a decisive point they must separate. This point might well be that at which the ego decides which side it will take. There's an old joke that neurotics build castles in the sky, psychotics live in them, and normal people pay the rent. That's another way of showing how we're all related, that the difference between being normal and being mentally ill is not always so neat and tidy. It is as if they existed along an imaginary yardstick, more a matter of degree than of kind. There is scarcely any condition generally recognized as normal, Freud wrote, in which it would not be possible to demonstrate neurotic traits. And even more to the point, the borderline between normal, nervous, and abnormal states is indistinct, and we are all slightly nervous. Defense mechanisms. We don't always like or even know the truth about ourselves or about others. We deny and we avoid. We manipulate. We play word games with each other. We try to change reality to suit our needs and make us feel better. In doing so, we behave much like boxers in the ring. We bob and weave in our conversations and relationships. We move fast, dance around in circles, always with our guard up. We seem to be saying, the best defense is a good offense. Freud called these verbal maneuvers defense mechanisms. He felt that the ego uses them to avoid danger, anxiety, and unpleasure. There are many defense mechanisms. Here are the more common ones. Perhaps you'll recognize yourself. Sublimation is the deflection of the libido from sexual gratification into other activities. Usually, we invest the libido in more socially acceptable channels such as the job, sports, hobbies, reading, writing, clubs, and committees, etc. In Freud's words, the process through which the excessive excitations from individual sexual sources are discharged and utilized in other spheres. Society approves of aggressive salesmen, pushy bosses, overworking employees, striving career girls, zealous missionaries, dedicated community helpers, and so on. Society disapproves sadism, masochism, peeping toms, exhibitionists, fetishists, and the like. All of these are examples of sublimation. Mr. A is a hard-working, successful business executive who works late, travels widely, is active in politics and in many trade organizations, president of the Beaver Society, likes to wash his car, work in the garden, work with his hands, watch the Late 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 Show, and golf, tennis, and swim at the country club. He is very annoyed when his wife mentions they haven't had sex for a month. When they were first married and for some years afterward, sexual frequency was much higher. Mr. A is sublimating. Regression is a return to a previous behavior of an earlier age. When Mrs. B asks her husband if she can buy a new hat, she sits fidgeting like she did whenever she asked her mother for money. Miss C refuses to let her sister borrow a dress to go to a dance. Miss C holds the dress close to her and gingerly replaces it in her own closet, smiling and proud. Mr. D is 42, but his $8,000 sports car is his pride and joy. He delights in fast getaways from traffic lights, enjoys being first, and drives pretty much the way he did when he got his first bike. Any childish behavior is regression. There are many variations: nail biting, chewing pencils or gum, temper tantrums, shouting, cursing, throwing things, pouting, weeping, kicking, the silent treatment, jealousy, etc. Projection is projecting your own wish, need, or desire or trait onto someone or something else. It is criticizing in others your own thoughts and desires. Old Mrs. E talks a good deal about those irresponsible girls who take the pill and do as they please. Freud would suggest that she is really saying that she would have liked to have had that freedom herself. In this way, one generation projects its own wishes and desires on the next. The poor project onto the rich, the religious on the irreligious, the North on the South, West on the East, you on me, and vice versa. Some people even project onto pets or animals in the zoo. Isolation is criticizing or branding a person because of one isolated incident or fault. It is making a judgment with insufficient evidence by one isolated example. Prejudice and stereotyping are forms of isolation. In this way, whole peoples can be labeled: blondes, Indians, Jews, teenagers, adults, the mentally ill, Catholics, redheads, cab drivers, airline stewardesses, nurses, psychiatrists, etc. ad infinitum. When someone begins the gossip rumor mill with "have you heard about," you can be sure that what comes next is projection or isolation. Rationalization is making excuses, copping out, head tripping, or intellectualizing. Miss F, who likes to be the center of attention, keeps everyone waiting at the big party and says when arriving, "I'm always late." Mr. G justifies buying his new car within a week of his neighbors doing the same by saying, "Well, my car's 2 years old and now is the best time to trade in." Young Mr. H tries to seduce his girlfriend, telling her everybody's doing it. Resistance is blocking or avoiding reality. And it happens, Freud said, when the ego finds it difficult to turn its attention to perceptions and ideas, the avoidance of which it had until then made a rule. In therapy, there can be continued resistance even when people know what their problem is and what they have to do to change their behavior. This makes change difficult. Freud called this phase of strenuous effort which follows upon this laudable resolution as the period of working through. Closely related to defense mechanisms are forgetting, dropping objects, and slips of the tongue. They are related because they involve material hidden in the unconscious breaking through in a specific way. Freud taught that forgotten material is not extinguished, only repressed, and in all cases is proved to be founded on a motive of displeasure. You have difficulty recalling the name of a boss you once worked for. Maybe it's the time lapse which explains why you can't remember his name. Freud would suggest it may be because you disliked him. You really don't want to remember his name, or more precisely, you don't want to remember him at all. Dropping objects can mean the expression of unconscious streams of thought, or it can represent the superstitious or odd significances connected therewith in popular sayings. Miss I feels guilty after having sex with her best friend's husband, so she drops a mirror, 7 years bad luck, and thus qualifies for punishment. Mrs. J resents her husband's pottery making hobby. It keeps him from her. She drops his favorite vase, not consciously realizing how this vents her resentment. Slips of the tongue enable unconscious hostility to break through the ego defenses. Mr. K, long annoyed at his secretary's messy desk, walks up to her one day with a letter she just typed and says, "Miss L, please correct this letter. An employment interviewer, annoyed with an impertinent job applicant, asks, "Mr. N, do you have a bachelor's degree?" A minister at the funeral of a known philanderer says, "He will live in immorality." Immortality. If the deceased were a virtuous man, he would have cause to wonder about the minister's innermost desires. Sexuality, male and female. In recent years, FemLib spokespersons have attacked Freud as one of history's biggest male chauvinist pigs. But Freud was down on both men and women. To be a man meant you had a penis, and according to Freud, that automatically means castration fear and an Oedipus complex, rivalry with your father over your mother's affection. To be a woman meant no penis, and that automatically meant penis envy and rivalry with your mother over your father's affection. Many people think of Freud as some kind of Victorian sex maniac. Actually, sexuality to Freud was a broad concept, which includes many activities that have nothing to do with the genitals. Your sex life, therefore, begins at birth. It involves the oral, breastfeeding, anal, toilet training, and genital phases described before. And it involves all your relationships with adults, father, mother, sisters, brothers, and playmates. But Freud did focus a great deal on genital behavior. A boy suffers from anxiety lest his father rob him of his male member, and so castration anxiety is one of the strongest influences on the development of his character. As the boy grows older, he discovers his own sex and wonders about others, including what his mother has. When he learns that women have no penis, this knowledge can cause disgust, which in the years of puberty may become the cause of psychic impotence, of misogyny, and of lasting homosexuality. The Oedipus complex was taken from the play by Sophocles, itself supposedly based on ancient dreams. It is the story of Oedipus, a man who unknowingly kills his father and also unknowingly marries his mother. When he discovers the shocking truth, he puts out his eyes as self-inflicted punishment. Freud called this act a symbolic substitute for castration. Freud was equally critical of female personality development. If we penetrate deeply into the neuroses of women, he wrote, we not infrequently meet with the represented wish to possess a penis. We call this infantile wish penis envy. It leaves ineradicable traces on her development and character formation. For a long time, she clings to the desire to get something like it, and analysis years later proves that it still persists in the unconscious. 3 things can develop from penis envy: sexual inhibition or neurosis, a masculinity complex, or normal femininity. Freud felt that a girl holds her mother responsible for her lack of a penis, and in fact never forgives her for that deficiency. She turns to her father as if he could provide her with it. The feminine situation is, however, only established when the wish for a penis is replaced by the wish for a child, the child taking the place of the penis. And a boy child brings the longed-for penis with him. Far-fetched? Men whose wives give birth to girls are still met with the joke that he should send her back to get finished. Marriage counselors report that many, perhaps most of their cases, involve a role reversal, domineering women and passive men. There are many young women wandering in search of identity as if they were missing something. These are the same dynamics Freud reacted to with his theory of sexuality. Today's theorists may only be using different words to describe the same situations. For the purpose of distinguishing between male and female in mental life, Freud wrote, we call everything that is powerful and active male, and everything that is weak and passive female. You might be surprised to learn that Freud considered the individual to be neither man nor woman, but both at the same time, only rather more the one than the other. He felt that there is a fusion of 2 symmetrical halves, of which, according to many authorities, one is purely male, the other female. Freud wasn't so permissive or accepting when it came to male homosexuals. He wrote very little about female homosexuals. In all our male homosexuals, he observed, there is a very intensive erotic attachment to a feminine person, as a rule, the mother. This happened before age 5 and was later forgotten. This attachment involved too much love from the mother herself, and was usually furthered by absence of the father during childhood. As the years pass, Freud theorized, the boy represses love for mother by taking her place, by identifying himself with her. In effect, he becomes a woman. Freud claims further research proves the homosexual remains fixed in his unconscious on the memory picture of his mother. He avoids women because they could cause him to be disloyal to his mother. Religion. Freud regarded religion as a universal obsessional neurosis. He felt that an obsessional neurosis was the pathological counterpart to the formation of a religion, and that the neurosis itself functioned like a private religious system. We close with this observation because many personality theorists feel that organized psychoanalysis has become a private religious system. Freud might have agreed, or he might have looked intently into the eyes of the questioner, as was his manner, and asked if there wasn't something more behind the question. Perhaps projection, or isolation, some resistance, or some unresolved Oedipal feeling. What do you think? And by the way, how's your ego doing today?